Atkinson. I work with the Montana Wilderness Association up here, and also Carol Treadwell is around here somewhere outside with the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. This is the third year that we've done this Wilderness Speaker Series together, and it's been a really great partnership, bringing in lots of cool speakers from all over the place. So thanks to the Bob Marshall Foundation for making it happen as well. So tonight we have a special guest from Canada. He's from Banff, Harvey Locke, who I just met a couple years ago, and I think many people find great inspiration in listening to him. And he's won a whole slew of awards that probably most of us don't have a clue what they are. But I'm going to introduce him properly by just doing a little reading of a proper bio, and then I'll let him take it from here. So Harvey Locke is a conservationist, writer, and photographer. He is a recognized global leader in the field of parks, wilderness, and large landscape conservation. He is a founder of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. In '99, he was named one of Canada's leaders for the 21st century in Time Magazine of Canada. In 13, he received the J.B. Harkin Medal for Conservation. In 2014, he was awarded the Fred M. Packard Award for Outstanding Service to Protect Areas by the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas of World Parks. I know you know what that is. Locke also received in 2014 the Gold Leaf Award from the Canadian Council on Ecological Areas for his lifetime of extraordinary commitment and vision to advance the causes of parks, wilderness, ecological integrity, landscape connectivity in the North American and in the world. So I am just tickled that he's here. Thank you, Harvey, for making the trip down and making your presentation for us.
Thank you, Amy. That was lovely, Amy. Thank you. I am so pleased to see all you folks here. There's 3 chairs here if somebody wants to be more comfortable. I will only go on for 4.5 hours, so don't worry if you're standing. I'm just thrilled to be here with you in Montana. I'm a kid from Alberta, and I like to share with Montana audiences that my forebears settled in southern Alberta by taking a steamboat up through Fort Benton and then a Red River cart into southern Alberta in the 1870s. So our parts of the world have been deeply connected for a very long time, and of course the indigenous people knew that as well. And I've become a citizen of this landscape, and I'm always thrilled to be here, in particular in the Flathead Valley. So let's hopefully have some fun tonight. I'm going to see if I can make all the technology work. I'll apologize in advance. The stretching in the images is unavoidable, so if you see round objects that look oblong, imagine that they're round. And we will hopefully have some fun. Please come on, sit down. So this is wilderness. This is where all of us are from. This is East Africa, the Savannah. This is the Serengeti National Park now. All of us are creatures of wilderness. And this is the only home in the universe for our species. There's only one, and this is it. And if we look at this beautiful thing, we see that it is a living whole. And what a fabulous place to call home. So I'm going to suggest to you that it's time we assumed our place as one species among many, as full citizens of this planet, by protecting it appropriately. So here's the challenge. From our evolutionary beginnings in the savannah through to the beginning of the last century, we were so few that we weren't that destructive. And we developed models that worked pretty well for us. So all of us are the product of great prosperity. Each of us has a standard of living that probably exceeds that of a king in the 17th century because of all the great things we have. But if you look at the world, 1900, there was 1.6 billion people in it. Okay, that's a really different world, and this is where people were in the landscape. There were indigenous people and things scattered across broader landscapes, but you can see broadly where people were concentrated in the world. That's a view of the world at night 10 years ago. Look how we have spread. Our density has just spread across the earth. It's quite remarkable. And that was 1 billion people ago. So we've added, since this picture, we've added as many people as existed on the face of the earth in 1900. So things have changed. And we need to change to take into account what's going on. So this is an interesting map. If you imagine this map, this is a map by Hoekstra, and I'll try to give credits because we're being videotaped to all of the people whose other work I'm sharing with you. And if I forget, I pray they'll forgive me. But this is a really fascinating study. This is called a map of crisis ecoregions. This is where the world's endangered species are concentrated. This is where things are really, really bad for nature. And look at that map, and I'm going to go back one. Look at that map. Okay, there's a correspondence there. Where we overwhelm the landscape with our presence, we overwhelm nature too. This is a really great study that comes out of Stockholm, a group led by a man named Johannes Rockström. It's called the Safe Operating Space for Humanity. And what this was an effort to do was to say, let's look at the conditions on Earth in which humans live, and let's look at the thresholds within which people are going to be healthy and well off, and where they get exceeded, and let's see if we can think holistically like that. So you can see there's a number of thresholds. There's chemical pollution, there's climate change, there's ocean acidification, and the green line there is where we're safe. And those red things that branch out are where we're in trouble, where we've exceeded them. And the 3 places we've exceeded are around nitrogen loading. So, you've heard about the dead zones in the Louisiana Delta and other places. That's from putting too much nitrogen in, non-point source, gets in rivers, goes downstream, kills everything because it's super eutrophied, except for the blue-green algae. And that's the issue of that. Climate change is getting a lot of attention lately. Very serious problem. We have too many parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. It affects the world. And the area of greatest accidents and the greatest concern is actually biodiversity loss. That's a fancy way of saying we're trashing nature. We are really overdoing it in the amount of the earth we're consuming and using and not protecting. So this is sort of where we've come in the last 115 years. And this is a really haunting thing that came out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. This is about impacts of climate change and other things. And this is the key point. It's other things as well. Simple point, the resilience of many ecosystems is likely to be exceeded this century. So picture that crisis ecoregions map spreading all over the world. That's really bad news for us. If we exceed the resilience of ecosystems, it's not just for nature, it's bad news for us because we drink fresh water. We kind of like to have a stable climate. And what's doing it is a combination of things. Global change drivers like land use change, pollution, and overexploitation of resources. So this is the future of business as usual. This is the gloom and doom scenario that makes a lot of young people really depressed. But it doesn't have to be our future. It is within our power to have a different future. And I'm going to talk about how we can do that, and how we can have a positive, beautiful, life-fulfilled future. So one of the things we've learned through the course of time is that we need to think big. If we're thinking about nature, we need to think at that huge scale that nature operates at. Nature is not a luxury, it's not a postage stamp, it's not a little place, it's a big holistic place. And the idea of nature conservation began right here at this wonderful place called Yellowstone. And I want to spend a moment on the power of ideas and the importance of ideas here. In the 19th century, there was this great surge of settlers like my family across the continent. And there was this sense of progress from the Industrial Revolution, and there were trains and cultivation and clearing of the land and the clearing of the forests and the killing of the large mammals. And then there was another countercurrent, though, in the culture at the time called Romanticism. The famous American Romantics were people like Emerson and Thoreau, Wordsworth before the English, and so on. And they made the case that nature was beautiful. Same time the Industrial Revolution is going on, these two ideas were in opposition. And they collided at a place called Yellowstone. And people saw this, and they said, you know what, in this case, progress consists in leaving it alone. protecting this fantastic place. And thus was born what Lord Bryce and also Wallace Stegner have said is America's best idea, the idea of a national park, the idea that we would leave this place alone in the landscape. And all began partly here in Montana. So we began by delineating boxes on the landscape, these square line places like Yellowstone, and then shortly thereafter, the Yellowstone Park Timberland Reserve, which is now the Shoshone or Shoshone National Forest, was the first national forest in the country. And you can see the straight lines, and and the thinking was that we would do things like this across the landscape. This is the original gateway to Banff National Park, Rocky Mountains Park, up where I live. It's the world's third oldest national park. Yellowstone is the oldest, Banff is the world's third oldest. So this idea spread out of the United States across the English-speaking world. And by the beginning of the last century, the 20th century, Australia had national parks, New Zealand had national parks, the United States had national parks, Canada had national parks, South Africa had parks that were similar in nature. And that's how fast that idea caught on. It was a heck of a good idea. And it's been really an interestingly effective tool to deal with the challenges of nature conservation. And you'll hear me being a very big fan of parks and wilderness tonight. I believe they are fundamentally important, and to be asked to give the Bob Marshall Foundation Wilderness Lecture with the Montana Wilderness Association is a very great personal honor for me too, because I'm a really big fan of Bob Marshall's. So let's look at this map for a moment. This is a map of carnivores and ungulates. So think of big teeth, big antlers, big horns. Okay, this is where they were across the continent. On the left side is historic distribution. So picture that. This is 200 years ago. You can see the colors are warm. You see oranges and reds. That means there's somewhere between 10 and 14 of these large mammal species in the landscape. Where you see the color is white, there's 0 of them left. And what you see, fascinatingly, is there used to be buffalo in Buffalo, New York, right? That's why it's called buffalo. And there were these large mammals all across the continent. Well, today, they're all jammed out here in the west and in the north. And you see the color simplifying where it's gone white. That's the great corn belts and wheat belts where they've just cultivated to the point where no large mammals can persist. Or one color, that's like a white-tailed deer or a coyote. And all the complex colors are almost primarily in the Yellowstone to Yukon region or in the north. Now, why might that be? Well, it's exactly related to the fact that we have large parks and wilderness areas. Look at the correlation on that map and the distribution of where those large animals are. And this is a correlation all over the world, by the way. It's not just in North America. These things work. They're fantastic. And Glacier Park, everybody knows, is a fantastic place. It's an engine of life for the entire landscape. So is Yellowstone. So are the complex of parks centered around Banff and the Canadian Rockies. These things really, really work well. And that's why they have the quality of life and all the wildlife around us still. But they don't work well in isolation. They need to be thought of as a system. They need to be connected together to fully function. And that's how 20-some years ago we got the idea of the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which you saw from that Nature article. As Yellowstone is the archetype as a park for an island, so Yellowstone to Yukon has become the global archetype of large landscape conservation. And this idea I was sharing today was in parts inspired by one of the people in this room, Diane Boyd, whose wolf research in the North Fork of the Flathead had a wolf that went all the way down to Yellowstone and another wolf that went all the way to mile 0 of the Alaska Highway, all from your North Fork Valley. And that's where mile 0 of the Alaska Highway is, and that's where the North Fork is, and that's where Yellowstone is. Pretty amazing, eh? And another person who in this room helped cook up all this thinking is John Weaver, who's sitting beside Diane, who's actually worked with me as an expert witness in a hearing near Banff in 1993. We were BSing about all these ideas some years ago, and I'm the only one who's still young, right, John? So anyway, all this stuff has rolled into a new field called conservation biology. And conservation biology is very interesting. The sort of founder of it or father of it is a man named Michael Soule, and he had an idea. He's a successful tenured academic. And Michael said, we study species going extinct, publish papers, and then get tenure. Doctors don't study patients dying, publish papers, and get wealthy. Doctors actually work on applying the knowledge they have to avoid the patient dying. Why don't we? That's the origins of conservation biology. Apply what we know to prevent the extinctions, to reduce the degradation of the earth, make it a better place. So we've actually had this wonderful flip where there's a wide variety of people all over the world who are now asking the question, what would it take to save nature? What do we need to do to have nature robust through time? Which is really hopeful. Like, let's set a menu and see if we can go and eat the meal. So there are 4 things you want to do. You want to protect all native types of ecosystem. You want to have populations of all native species distributed around the landscape. You want ecological processes like fire and flooding to continue. And you want resilience, meaning that the system's big enough and interconnected enough to be able to stand changes like things in the change of the climate or big storms or whatever. When you roll those things up, studies done all over the world come back and say you need to protect about half of the landscape in an interconnected way. That's how much of the landscape we need to put for nature, manage for nature, if we want to have the landscape be resilient, functional, and maintain all its species through time. And it's really important that that be connected, not isolated parcels. And this is a literature review article, which is by Heller and Zavaleta. And it says, in simple terms, people figure landscape connectivity is the best way to deal with the changing climate. So things can move around the landscape. And they'll move up the landscape, up latitude, so from here north to Canada. They'll move upslope, so from Lake McDonald up to Logan Pass. And they'll move around aspect, which is really interesting. You live in a landscape here where the south-facing slopes are grassy. Think of Mount Jumbo down in Missoula. And then you got Snowball ski area not far behind on the north face. That's around aspect. So those 3 things are the basic things nature can do to move around a landscape. And you need it knitted together at a really large scale. And this is the key point. This is an article I really like by Jenny Hodgson and others in 2009. That's really nice, but the big point is save big chunks of wild country. That's what you need, and then you can have your elevational gradients inside your big blocks of wild country, and you can have your diverse landscapes inside your big protected areas. So the core of nature conservation remains, even in the climate change world, big protected areas. And so all of this is rolled up into a new discipline that we call large landscape conservation. Some people call it connectivity conservation. It's all the same thing. And this is I promise I won't have any more heavy-duty slides like this, but it's a useful one because I'm going to walk you through these ideas and how they kind of work in our landscape and how they lead us to an optimistic scenario, not a pessimistic one. So basically the idea is you have large spaces that are protected, big enough to ensure viable populations of species, you'll see the bold letters, so they can move between the systems of protected areas to maintain and restore processes across a landscape that are all, the landscape is also occupied by people, and so the whole thing can be done so people and species can adapt. That's the big integrated idea. So I'm going to walk you through some of those core concepts. So large. Why large? This is an interesting map of Middlesex Fells Reservation in Boston. Middlesex Fells was a rocky area that was surrounded by farmland when it was created as a park in the 1890s. And I actually went into the library in New England when I lived there and read the press clippings. It was designed to protect the wilderness of the Middlesex Fells in the 1890s in Boston. And their goal was, especially, it was really rich with plant species. And because Boston has had universities for a long time, there's actually somebody went in and inventoried the plants in 1890s, which is really unusual. So in the 1890s, they inventoried the plants, and there are 30 native plants and 17 exotic species. And then, and I'm sorry I'm not able to give the reference to the study, I have it. Some scientists went back in from a new university in Boston in the 1990s and said, well, things have changed. This park is now surrounded by the city of Boston. It's no longer a wilderness park out surrounded by farms. It's now this island of wildness surrounded by city. How's it doing? Well, we're down to 230 native plants and 70 exotics. And what was interesting is the plants that were disappearing were plants like this, the wood lily. So bulb reproducing plants weren't finding a way if they were removed from the system by people digging them from gardens or disease, they had no way to recolonize the place. It was just simply isolated. The burr reproducing species that stick to animal fur have dropped out too, because there's no animals moving in and out. But the species that are still aerially connected through pollens and pollination and all that are still reproducing because they're still connected to the broader landscape. So that's an interesting sort of, that small doesn't work. What about if we scale up a little bit? This is Point Pelee National Park. It's a peninsula that sticks into Lake Erie in southern Ontario in Canada, just north of Cleveland. And it's very far south, so that's called a Carolinian forest type, which is the kind of forest they have in North Carolina. And it's the area behind it is a park behind the flag and the gate. The area in front of it is tomato fields. And if you eat Heinz ketchup, that's probably where they came from. It's from the tomato fields in Leamington, Ontario. And that's transformed the edge of the park completely. And this is a graphic from Stephen Woodley of historically these amphibians were present in that park. They were inventoried. So salamanders, toads, frogs, things like that. 1972, 3 of them are gone. 1994, half of them are gone. And that's isolating this place, not having a landscape context for those things to remain viable, and they just drop out through time. If we scale up, however, and you see where we have these big blocks of effective habitat, this is a good graphic by Carlos Carroll, who's a GIS whiz. You can see on this map, oops, what's going on here? Well, there's this big place called Yellowstone. There's the Bob Marshall Wilderness. There's Glacier Park. This is the Selway Bitterroot area. There's Banff and Jasper. And remember where the colors were hot, where the distribution of the large mammals were? It's exactly there where these big wild places are. It's really simple and kind of inspiring when you know that you guys live on the edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Glacier Park. So how much of this landscape needs to be protected? I mentioned a figure. Well, this is a study that from 2004, a bunch of experts and modelers from both sides of the Canada-US border asked how much of what's called the Canadian Rockies, but is really from Missoula. So this goes from the Clark Fork River up to the top of Jasper National Park. So half Montana, half Alberta and BC. How much of the landscape would you need to protect all the things that live in it in this landscape where we're sitting right now? And the answer they came up with was 49.7%. But we haven't addressed connectivity or resilience to climate change in that number. So right around half. That's the range that we need to protect in this landscape. So I did a big survey around the world as part of this idea we call Nature Needs Half. Is what other studies are out there? Well, this is the Western Ghat Mountains in India. This is one of the most biologically productive and diverse places in the world. Has the largest tiger population in the world, 500 tigers. It has over 1,000 wild Asian elephants. It has these over 1,000 gar, which is this really kind of funky looking Asian type bison, but it's not a bison. It's really a great place, and look how wild it is. There's 5 national parks all jammed together there, 4,500 square kilometers. And a study of this Western Ghats mountain range, like the Rockies, runs from the tip of India up to Bombay. It's a big wall of mountains along the coast, and very, very wonderful. There was an expert panel struck of Indian ecologists, and they said that we need to protect about 60% of the landscape in an interconnected way to hang on to its values. That's southern India, tropical, subtropical area. This is a study done by a number of well-known ecologists on the Cape Floristic region in southern tip of Africa. If you have a jade plant, it came from here. There's only half a dozen kingdoms of plants on Earth, and one of it is completely confined to the southern tip of Africa. It's amazing. So all the weird flowers you get from your florist, they all came from there. And it's this fantastic place, and it has like elephants and lions normally, and it's a really interesting landscape. Cape Town is in the middle of it. This study, if you wanted to maintain all the values of the Cape Floristic region, 52%. How about this wonderful place, the Serengeti Mara ecosystem? I've had the good fortune of spending a bit of time there, and it's incredible. Over 60% of the Serengeti is protected. And some people think that's not quite enough. And what that enables is this. This is like really wow. I mean, if you have a bucket list, and you know, this I took from my tent this last June in the Serengeti. This is the wildebeest migration, and if you look into that photograph, that's the leading edge of 1 million animals. And if you look at the photograph for a second, look right to the horizon. It's all animals. And they're coming, and they just passed for hours. That, of course, is what our Great Plains were like when my ancestors came up the Missouri by steamboat. They had to stop the steamboat for 7 hours below Fort Benton for a buffalo herd to cross. My mother's grandmother saw that. So that's where we were once. We were once here. Because they've protected this system in excess of 60% and are thinking about it ecologically, and this is the last remaining wildebeest migration in Africa. There were 6 70 years ago. There's now 1, this one. So scale matters. And then this is the Amazon at dawn. I had the good fortune of being on top of a tower in the Amazon, the unbroken Amazon forest, from where the Amazon rolls up through Brazil into Guyana, and I went to Tom Lovejoy's famous Camp 41, where the forest fragmentation research was done, if you know about that, where they did these plots of 10 hectares and 100 hectares to see what happens when you do that. And anyway, I had the good fortune of spending New Year's there. And this place is amazing. So the Brazilians have protected 50% of the Amazon. Did you know that? It's really impressive. A variety of mechanisms, national parks, Aboriginal areas that are not used for industrial purposes, and that aggregate is about 50% in Brazil. Why it matters in this setting, it's a different set of reasons than in the others, but you see that mist coming out of the trees? The Amazon rainforest creates its own rain. This is an incredible phenomenon. Tom Lovejoy figures we must maintain at least 80% of that forest intact, or else it won't be able to create its own rain. And what happens is the moisture rolls in off of the Atlantic Ocean into the forest, it rains, and then the forest breathes out, releases moisture, and when it's fixing carbon dioxide, it's breathing out, and it's also breathing out little aerosols. And these little aerosols become the seeds for rain, and then they fall again. And they're organic aerosols. There's a Max Planck Institute study on this. It's really quite fascinating. So this forest is generating its own rain because it's big and because it's intact. So the scale of Amazon protection needs to be in the range of 80%. And yet we have this gap. We have what policymakers say we should do. So if you're aware of something called the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United States is not a signatory, but it participates as kind of one of these weird things. The goal set internationally for nature conservation is 17% of the land should be protected. Okay, and that's 180 countries have signed on to that goal, including mine, Canada. There is no study that says that is adequate. Okay, just think about that for a minute. There is no study that says that is adequate. So the gap between what we learn from scientists trying to assess what we need versus what policymakers are doing is a very large one. Now, think for a minute whether bankers would tolerate that kind of a gap. You know, then the goals set for these conventions are things like lessen the rate of biodiversity loss. That was the goal set in 2002. Well, guess what? It didn't work. Imagine a banker saying, go bankrupt slowly. That's our inspiring goal for the 21st century. Go bankrupt slowly. And then they changed it to halt biodiversity loss. Okay, which means maybe don't go bankrupt. It doesn't mean let's flourish. It doesn't mean let's get rich. It means let's make it less bad. Maybe we can stop the bleeding with all kinds of problems and all those crisis ecoregions in the world still there and everything else. Why don't we have a goal of making nature whole? Why don't we do that? Why don't we dream of an intact world? We know now what it would take. And what's fascinating, I'm sitting in a room full of people who live in one of those places in the world where this is not only possible, it's happening. You have protected close to half of western Montana. If we get the connectivity parts right and keep the management right, strangely enough, you'll have all your native species. And do you? Sure you do. And we'll get wild buffalo back yet, which will be the missing piece. So for those of you who like science and want to read this all rolled up, this is a paper that I wrote called Nature Needs Half, which rolls up all these ideas and explains these targets and so on, and you're welcome to read it. You'll note that E.O. Wilson is coming out with a book this week called Half Earth, same idea, expressed in a different way, but he's got the same conclusion, and same idea. That's the scale that we need to be at. So I want to then move into this idea of viable populations of native species. So we talked about how much needs to be protected, and this viable populations idea is kind of interesting. And it's a really hard thing to figure out how to do, as we can't study every animal. We just don't have the capacity. But some people developed this idea, and it's turned out to be a pretty good one, of the umbrella species, which is if you protect a species that's representative of a bunch of things, you may get a lot of the others. And so some of the assessments in our part of the world suggest that if you can keep grizzly bears in our landscape, roughly 80% of all the other species will survive. That's why grizzly bears matter so much, not just because they're fantastic, they're super cool, they're beautiful. It's also because if we can keep them, we keep roughly 80% of everything else in the system. So that's why they're such a good thing to focus on and why it's important to keep them. And if you look at this map, which came from Bruce McClellan, who's did a lot of the grizzly bear work in the Flathead Valley, imagine that map of North America with those colors that I talked about, the big horns, big teeth, all that. This is the grizzly bear layer. Imagine unpacking that. And what you see is the patterns of protected areas and why they matter. So here's where bears were 200 years ago. Out on the Great Plains, Lewis and Clark saw them in Great Falls. Everybody in here knows that. They were in northern Mexico. They were in California. That's why they're on the California state flag. They were in Alaska. They were in Alberta, British Columbia, Montana, and Wyoming. Okay? And where they are today is in red. So up in the north, and then a narrow peninsula of them running down the Rocky Mountains to the bottom of the Bob Marshall Wilderness in the Blackfoot Valley. And then there's an island population of them in Yellowstone. So you can see that here, the red population in Yellowstone. What's really important about this map is where they were in 1922. They were in all these little islands. And all those little islands have gone extinct. So I was giving a talk like this at the Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado, and they actually had the last grizzly bear in Colorado killed in 1959 in a glass case down the hall from where I was talking. No kidding, they have it there. There you can see it. And if you go into California Legion of Honor, you can see the last grizzly bear in California. So what's happened is that the mechanism that applied to those plants and the Middlesex fells or to the amphibians happens with grizzly bears. And how you can tell how big it is, how about 8 million acres in the Selway Bitterroot, Bob Marshall, Selway Bitterroot country, it lost its bears. There's 4 million acres of protected wilderness and 4 million acres of de facto wilderness, it still lost its bears. Because it became isolated in the landscape, where they were killed out of there, the change from the dams and the dropping out of salmon, the habitat conditions, and the bears dropped out. And what we need to do is not have that happen to Yellowstone. And you no doubt know there's a delisting of Yellowstone grizzly bears underway. Their population is somewhere around 500, which some people think might be sufficient. But there's nobody who's an expert on Yellowstone grizzly bears who doesn't think the best thing that can happen to them is to reconnect them up to the rest of the landscape so they don't turn into the same problem there. Whatever your position is on delisting, everyone's position is if they're connected, they're healthier than if they're not connected. And that's sort of the essence of our whole Yellowstone to Yukon idea. So how do we learn about how grizzly bears work? Well, brave people dart them. I was fortunate to be out with Mike Proctor, who's a grizzly bear biologist from the Canadian side of the line, and he's just you see the dart on the shoulder of the bear? He's just put that dart in, and that bear is not happy, so it's trashing that tree. And that bear is just like ripping that tree apart in front of us. It's an amazing thing to watch. And then it got sleepy, and down it went. And this is that same bear now in a better mood. And they're taking great care of it. You see the oxygen tubes, the collars. Like these people who do this kind of work love their subjects, and they take great care to do it. So it's being weighed, and its DNA samples being taken to sex it, and it's not to sex it, but to identify the individual. A little residual tooth is taken out to identify the individual, and so on. And the result of this is we have learned this kind of work. Think of Kate Kendall's work in Glacier Park, same type of stuff. Through this kind of work, all these wonderful scientists pooled all their radio collar data and all these fantastic studies and did this giant monograph paper about 4 years ago that said, this is where grizzly bears are in our landscape. This is what we know from data. And Mike is Proctor et al., so that fellow is the lead author, but he's certainly not the only contributor, and be quick to tell you that. And those are the numbers of what we know about where bears are. And you can see It corresponds to that graphic I just showed you, Bruce McClellan's. But these little yellow lines are really interesting. These are the fragmenters that are creating subpopulations. And there's actually a big fragment here where the yak population has been isolated from the cabinet population. And down here you can see the Yellowstone's totally isolated. But you can see the numbers of bears now in this system here. We're around 994 between Highway 3 and the bottom of the Bob into the Blackfoot. And you can see but you see all these lines, these correspond to gravel bed river systems. Gravel bed river systems, transportation corridors, and human settlements. That's where all the fragmenters are in the landscape. And I'll come back to the importance of gravel bed river systems in a minute. So what is a gravel bed river system? Well, this is the Elbow River, which has come out of the mountains just west of Calgary. We think that this is the river, right? We think that that surface that's there is the river. Actually, the work done by folks at the Flathead Lake Biological Station and University of Montana and elsewhere, like Dr. Rick Hauer, shows that actually the river is from there to there. And the way you can see that in this photograph is this is the slack water of a dam in Calgary. That's actually, see how that's all the river. And what's happened is over time that river will just move across the top of that surface back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you can see how historically that happened here. It's just all exposed. So the river is like this big saturated sponge where the surface of the river is going across the top of it, and it will just decide to change course from time to time. And that whole thing is the river. And that whole thing turns out to be the most ecologically rich part of the entire landscape, used by almost every species in the system. So we've been able to learn that the gravel bed river function is sort of that last 20%. If you can keep grizzly bears and gravel bed rivers intact and all the things that go with the process of gravel bed rivers, our system will be okay. And what's fascinating is this is a eureka moment. A number of us collaborated on a paper that we just submitted, including amphibian people, cottonwood people, bird people, carnivore people, ungulate and wolf people, bear people, limnologists, and it's just sort of this amazing moment of realizing, yes, for just about everything, the river bottom, that intact gravel bed river system, is a driver or the ecological nexus of the whole landscape. So this is the North Fork of the Flathead on the Canadian side, with an intact gravel bed river system. Why is this such a fabulous place? Because nothing is affecting the process in that river. There's no levees, there's no dams, there's no houses, there's no farms. Totally wild, totally intact. That's why it's the most important valley to protect for typical North American biodiversity left in the world, the North Fork of the Flathead on the Canadian side. John Weaver, who's sitting in the room, did a study 15 years ago, said this is the most important basin for large carnivores on the continent. And it's driven by this river system and the fact that the landscape is intact, and the fact that on the American side, you of course have created Glacier Park and you've managed your side to a pretty high standard. This is the upper part of the headwaters of the Flathead. That's what those gravels look like. So next time you see that gravel surface, you know, what's fascinating about this, if you look at this as an ecosystem, there's as much variety going on in 2 vertical meters of this system as there is in a 500 meters of slope on the mountainside. So you go from a bare colonizing surface, see those gravels, to a willow bushes, and then you're into mature old growth spruce. And you also have cottonwood that are about 100 years old, all in 2 meters of elevation or less. And that's what's so magic about these systems. So the other thing that's really important is this question of survival between protected areas. You remember those fragmented lines I showed of where the bears break up? So this is a more detailed map of the fundamental challenge to conservation in our part of the world in terms of connectivity. It's Highway 3 through the Crow's Nest Pass, along the Purcell Mountains and the Selkirk Mountains in southern Canada. This is what will determine whether your large carnivores remain connected or not. It just happens to be in Canada. This is the big, bright red line of Yellowstone to Yukon. So we spend a ton of time focusing on keeping that from breaking apart. Because even though it's a continental scale vision, that's the front line of the whole deal. And this is how we do it. So this is a land trust person, Rob Neal, with Mike Proctor. Mike saying this is where the bears cross that piece of private land on this road right there. So then we talk to the landowner and try to buy it. And in this case, the landowner was happy to sell it. And these are actually those linkages. It gets really refined. So it looks like peninsula, but within that peninsula, there's only a few places left where the animals are actually using the landscape. So one is Duck Lake right here. One is Kidd Creek here. And then our best understanding, based on modeling and everything else, for a reconnection to connect the Cabinet and Yak is here west of Troy. So we've been working on buying parcels of private land from private landowners who are willing, the variety of land trusts, and also with timber companies to try to secure that landscape. And this is an example. This is Kidd Creek. That is not in wilderness condition, right? That landscape is used for a variety of purposes, but it turns out that this is one of the 2 or 3 linkages that connect the Purcells and Selkirks between Canada and the United States for grizzly bears, right through there. So we bought this parcel and we're in discussions with the owner of this parcel. So it's amazing. You can go from 2,000 kilometer long corridor from Yellowstone to Yukon and it can come down to 68 acres. And this is a really interesting thing about large landscape conservation. There's one place near Duck Lake, which is, gets to the point of the landscape can be used for a variety of human purposes. This is the Duck Lake linkage. There's something that Mike Proctor calls the 28-inch linkage zone, where animals actually come through at one spot, 28 inches wide. And then they fan out. And this valley bottom area here near Creston, British Columbia, just north of Bonners Ferry in that country, this is the one big linkage that connects the Selkirks and Purcell Mountains. That's Duck Lake, and there's Mike in the image. And so, interestingly, it's a grain field. And we got an easement on the grain field because the grain field is allowing passage. It won't change from being a grain field. What we didn't want was fences. And it turns out, because it's confined, it's also a critical corridor for the endangered mountain caribou and for northern leopard frogs, which is the only population left in southern Canada. So that umbrella effect, quite fascinatingly, is playing out. And how that works, this is how the data matters from these scientific studies. It really matters that people do primary science. They may not always feel that way when you're doing it, but believe me, it matters. This is Duck Lake, and these are bears trying to move from the Selkirks to the Purcells. You see the purple bear here comes down and bounces off, bounces off, bounces off, bounces off, goes back, finally finds a way around through Duck Lake and ends up back here. Yellow bear, same thing, bouncing off, bouncing off, bouncing off, oops, through Duck Lake. So that's the one place that we could go to secure it, and we were really fortunate. The landowner is very sympathetic, and we bought some of it with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, put some under easement, and we've now protected the corridor. That's what it looks like. And you can see it'll still be farmed for grain farming, but it's this connectivity that we were after there, not wilderness values per se. And this is what a community of people has been able to do, focusing on those linkages I showed you, plus Highway 3 and the Crow's Nest Pass over the last 10 years. We've been able to secure that much land with that much money. And the neat thing about this large landscape conservation is it's about a community of people doing stuff. It's not about me doing stuff. It's about us doing stuff. It's about society doing stuff. If we don't all row together in service of a collective vision, we fail. There is no NGO, no government that could do it all by itself. It has to be done collaboratively. And you see an interesting name on here, which is Teck. That's a mining company in Canada that bought $21 million of land for conservation connectivity, specifically to help out with this vision. It's quite an interesting story. And this is, I'm going to take you into ground zero, the heart of the place, the key linkage, the most important linkage for large carnivores in North America, right there, Alexander Creek and Michelle Creek inside the Crow's Nest Pass, the BC side of the Crow's Nest Pass. John's study is part of how we know this. This is an interesting, so I'm not going to bore you with a lot of science, but there's multiple ways you find out stuff. You put a collar on an animal and watch it walk across through its satellite and see where it goes. That's one way you can find out. The other way you can model is habitat effectiveness using a variety of tools. This is a fancy technique called CircuitScape, where you figure out, using circuit theory, how many times the thing's likely to rotate through the place. Out pop the same linkage. 6 different models plus applied field studies. Everybody comes, this is the number one linkage left. So a good bit of news I'll share with you is with that timber mining company Teck, all of Alexander Creek has been bought or donated for conservation protection. Pretty fantastic just in the last couple of years. Bad news is this area has been bought by a private timber company that's aggressively logging it, and they just subdivided part of it out to a mining company for an open pit mine. So we got lots of work to do there. And this matters a lot to the people in this room. Strangely enough, the interesting thing about doing something at the scale of Yellowstone to Yukon or large landscape conservation is, from a Canadian point of view, that's the bottom of the big funnel. From an American point of view, it's the top of the big funnel. So this is why we have to work together. This is why conservation isn't just a national or a regional concern. We have to think about what we're trying to achieve on the earth, why we must work together. So this point of being able to move is not only about land condition, but we also have these things called highways. And these things tend to move east-west across the landscape, while the mammals tend to move north-south in the Rocky Mountains, so they come into a collision. Some of you will remember Dr. Seuss's north-going Zacks and south-going Zacks. This is the challenge, is that things are moving across the landscape. And interestingly, you will have, almost all of you, driven through the highway crossing structures on the Kootenay Salish land between Missoula and here. Well, they're modeled after the pioneering work done in Banff Park on a bigger, busier road. And it's an example of ideas moving across the system once people care. There's now some overpasses in Pinedale, Wyoming. And interestingly, the most complete systems, and we're not done yet, but the most systems of highway crossing structures anywhere in North America is in the Yellowstone to Yukon region. And it's not an accident. It's because people are thinking about connectivity in this region. And the Wyoming Department of Transport did the overpasses in Wyoming. And that was informed by something called the Path of the Pronghorn and so on. And we see this idea replicating and moving through. We need I-90 to be mitigated like this highway here is in Banff. And so the way it works in Banff at scale, where we're really fortunate that we have wild country on either side of the road, there's a fence along the road that directs the animals onto these overpasses. There's 5 of these overpasses across the highway. And then there's another 39 underpasses of varying shapes and sizes. And that's a grizzly bear on top of an overpass. They really work. They've a fantastic system. It's reduced roadkill enormously, and it's increased the animals' usage of the landscape. And this is an encounter that no one wants at one of the underpasses. Big bull elk and a wolf. And this is some data. This is 10-year-old data, but it's a wonderful chart because that's when they tip past 200,000 individual animal movements through the system. And that could be the same animal multiple times. It's not 200,000 different animals. But that's how effective it's been, and the number is way higher now. And what's interesting is you can also see different species use different things. So you see, deer will just about use anything, but the bighorn sheep are only overpass in one place, and they're using some underpasses. And it's really fascinating. You need a suite of these structures, small ones, big ones, different species like different things, but it's that suite that works. And I like to use this as an example. We can figure out how to live with nature. This has reduced road mortality enormously in Banff Park, and one of the great questions was, would it work at the level of an animal living in the system? Would it work at the level of one male every 10 years dashing across to breed with the next village, if you will, which would avoid genetic drift, but that's all it would achieve? Or would it be like one seasonal movement where there's so much pressure, like the lemmings off the cliff, that things burst through the system and then burst back once a year for seasonal reasons? Or would it be mama bear wakes up with her cubs on one side of the road and has breakfast and then ambles through the overpass and has lunch on the other side? That third condition is what's the desired condition, because then the habitat is effective on both sides. That third condition is actually how these are working. There are animals that have now learned to spend their day on both sides of the road using this system. It's really, really, there's a PhD on that by Mike Sawadi. And then this question of between systems of protected areas. Okay? It's not just about roads and private lands, it's also about public lands. The big thing we need to do is we need to do a conservation job on the British Columbia side of the border just north of you. We need to fill in the missing piece of Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, which is this big straight line. I don't know if you've ever been up the North Fork to the Canadian border, but there's a straight line there. And on the other side of Glacier Park, in the same woods, it's still open to logging, trophy hunting, off-road vehicles. On the other side, it's Glacier Park, Montana. It's a really goofy boundary. And what we don't have is any land use regime that ensures connectivity between Banff and Glacier. And we need one. And we need one for all the reasons I've been describing. And this is where, imagine adding that to Glacier Park. Yeah, ha, cool. So I'm going to just take you, so this is interesting because this is a question of perspective. This is the New York Science Times featuring John's study from a few years ago. Picture I took up on the divide between Waterton and the Flathead on the Canadian side. America's wildest valley. What's really fascinating is the Flathead watershed in the United States is the most protected watershed in your country. On the Canadian side, it's completely unprotected except for a tiny sliver of a provincial park up in the high country. It's this huge anomaly. And the good news is on the Canadian side, no one lives there, so it's been out of sight and out of mind. So it's still something we could protect. But we have this really weird thing, and many of you will know that there's been some controversy about the different land use regimes. That's the border. Okay? That's Glacier Park on the right, Canadian Flathead on the left. It's taken from Mount Hefty. And you might remember this controversy. And this is where people in this room can take a lot of credit for the Canadian Flathead being intact, and people from Montana, including the senators and the governor at the time and many others. This is BC's pristine Flathead Valley. Who's fighting hardest to save it? Our American neighbors. So this is where that leverage has gone the other way, and it made a real difference. And some of you will remember that on the eve of the Winter Olympics, Gordon Campbell, the Premier of BC, felt such pressure on this issue that he announced that there would be no mining in oil and gas in the Canadian Flathead. He invited Governor Schweitzer to be there for that announcement. That was a very good thing, but it's really important to remember stopping a bad is not doing a good. That was not a conservation action. It was a disaster prevention strategy. Okay? It's really important to note the distinction. The Flathead is not protected. Not at all. It's just not that activity that's going to occur there. And I'm going to take you on a little tour of this edition of the missing piece of what could be added to Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. So this is up high. This is Long Knife Peak. If you've ever been to Kintla Lake and wondered what the top of that big mountain on the left is, it's actually in British Columbia. That's what it looks like. The floral diversity is fantastic. This is the richest place for vascular plants in all of Canada, and it's one of the great ecotone mixing zones in North America. It's a different mixture of plants, much more characteristic of the Banff Park area. These plants are much more characteristic of this area south towards Colorado. This is just down the ridge a little bit, and you have this different thing. So by comparison, there are 685 plant species in Banff Park and 1,100 in Waterton Glacier. It's that much richer. This, of course, is a glacier lily. Wonderful plant. Everybody knows what that is. This is an endemic to this region. It's called a Cascadian plant, and it's the only place it occurs. But the hotbed of it is in this part of the world. It doesn't go north of the top of the Flathead River. I've never seen a beargrass north of the Flathead River drainage. And this is why it's so cool. This is from the Glacier Waterton Park brochure. It's this incredible ecotonal mixing zone. So you have Arctic plants, boreal plants coming down from the north, Southern Rocky Mountain plants up from the south, the maritime species coming in from the west, and prairie species coming in from the east. And the reason the maritime species come in here, not further north, is there's no high mountains west of here. So you've got this, your first high mountains are right here. So all that stuff is jamming up here. Whereas up in Banff, we've got very high mountains to the west of Banff Park, if you've ever been to the Rogers Pass. And it's a great place to be a tree hugger. This, of course, is a white pine tree that's healthy and alive. This is, again, on the Canadian side. You might recognize that kind of a landscape. This is the Nunatak. This is one of the most magical places in the mountains anywhere. And some of you will remember a man named Andy Russell, who did the first film on grizzly bears, wrote Grizzly Country, Horns in the High Country. This was Andy's outfitting territory, and Burt Riggle before him. So if you've read any of those stories, they're about this place. And Andy was a friend of mine, and he told me where his trails are, and I've spent a good chunk of the last 20 years finding all these abandoned trails with my friend John Brzezinski. And he told me once, he said, you know, this feature here is called the balcony. So this is what's at Granite Park, right? This is ledge. This is in Canada, this ledge. So this is it's called the balcony up here. And this Nunatak is a feature where the ice goes around the rock and doesn't knock the center down. So it's this incredible thing sitting there. And Andy said, you know, there's a pass there. And I said, well, I know that. You go through here, you go into Glacier Park, you're right above North Kintla Lake. It's wonderful. He said, no, I'm not talking about that pass. I'm talking about the pass there. And I'm like, you know, he's like, I think we're talking about different places, Andy. He said, no, there is a pass there. you can walk through that pass. It's just wide enough for a grizzly bear. And so, like, I really thought I had it wrong, but he did know his country. And so I went up there, and turns out there's this feature up there called the Painted Wall he told me about at Grizzly Wide Pass. And this is 1,000 feet of lichens painted on the rocks. And I'm like, well, I see the Painted Wall, Andy. But what about the pass? Well, here's the features of the Painted Wall. Isn't that incredible? That's 1,000 feet spread across that mountainside. It's the most marvelous thing. And that's the trail. That's a natural trail. It's not blasted. It's not a Pitamakan tunnel. And it's used by goats and by me and my pals. And it's just wide enough for a grizzly bear right in that crack there. You go through that crack. Isn't that cool? This is on the Alberta-Canadian Flathead border looking south towards those mountains. Pretty fantastic place. This is the top of Commerce Creek and West Castle River on the divide. This is a place we call Roses Canyon. And that's the North Fork of the Flathead River doing exactly what a river should do. It's in high water season. You can see now there's 2 channels appearing on that sponge. This is the jewel. Protecting the bottom of that river system up to the high mountains is one of, unquestionably, for typical North American biodiversity. So think of the things that we think of when we think of animals in North America. There is no more important thing we can do than protect this place. Full stop, period. It's that important, and I've said that to audiences all over the world, and I've never had anybody argue with me. And this is just how shared the landscape is. This is trout moving back and forth between Montana and British Columbia. Okay, this is just one system. Here we are down here, and the trout redding up here or doing their beds where they put their eggs in the streams, swimming back and forth. And we did some interesting stuff. John's comprehensive study, Diane's primary research, Bruce's grizzly bear research was sort of a foundation layer. In the last 6 years, we've done a series of bioblitzes in the Canadian Flathead. And Steve Gnidek was one of the birders who was with us on one of those bioblitzes. And so the first bioblitz we did was bugs. Okay, big deal, bugs. Well, bugs are cool. And these people from the Royal British Columbia Museum came in, and they're looking around, they're collecting spiders. They found a new species. They found a super productive hotspot for a species they thought was extremely rare. And they got back to their lab and they did their evaluation. They said, there are no non-native spiders in the Flathead. 70% of the spiders in Victoria or Vancouver are non-native. None in the Flathead. So we're like, wow, this is an interesting piece of information. So we had plant bioblitzes done. There's some weeds along the side of the roads. Those are non-natives. Then we had Lipitsky's in doing snail research. There's no non-native snails. And then we had our bird bioblitz, and birders are fascinating. They're all very quiet, and they're solitary, and they're very determined. They get up early in the morning, and it was really interesting to referee a methodology fight between 10 birders and the bioblitz. Anyway, we ended up using all the methodologies, so it's all good. But we have these wonderful birders in at the end of June, the flood year a couple years ago, and they're out doing the first serious comprehensive bird work in the Flathead, although there's some important individual surveys done before, but this was this big blitz of really good birders. And one day, Jason Rogers, who's a characteristic kooky birder, really great guy, big tall guy who sleeps in his little yellow car at night, and then he goes out birding by himself, and he's one of these guys who birds like this, because he knows all the songs. Good birders don't use binoculars, right? They're like this. It's quite amazing. And he comes back and he says, I had a location today where there were all four species of chickadee at one location. So chestnut, back, the boreal, the mountain, and the black-capped chickadee all on one site. And everyone else looks at him and they're like, well, this guy's an idiot. That doesn't happen. So he said, well, come with me tomorrow. So 2 guys go with him the next morning, and it's for real. All 4 species in one place. It's the same thing that's going on with those plants. The same thing that's going on with the carnivores. They're all mashing together in this wonderful place informed by this fantastic river. And then about, I don't know, night 6 of 7, we're all sitting around and getting debriefed on the day's stuff, and Steve was there, and we said, has anybody seen a non-native bird? Nope. No, and had anybody seen a common bird like a Canada goose? No. No. So incredible. And in a week we found 118 species of birds at the end of June. Jason, who did historical work, when they did the first surveys of birds in Banff Park in 1911, in the summer season they found 68. We now know there's 315 species of birds that use Banff Park, but at the time that gives you a sense of just how incredible this place is. And, you know, you're going down the river, there's a sandpiper at every possible ecological niche down the river. There was a birder from California he said, this is unbelievable. I mean, you just don't see this. Every niche is occupied by something. That's how special this place is. It's just mind-blowing, and it's important for bats. It's probably a big corridor for bats. I mean, everything that you could imagine is in this wonderful place. It's also part of the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa First Nation. And here's the stark reality, okay? There is Glacier Park. There's Waterton Park. This is the new Castle Park in Alberta that was just created last September, 1,000 square kilometers of additional wildland park and provincial park, just created last September. And look at the missing piece right there in the British Columbia Flathead. That's what we have to fix. That's what the pictures I've been showing you are of. And that's what success looks like. Filling in the missing piece is a critically important thing for us to do, and we all need to work on it, and we can get there. I know this can happen. And wouldn't it be grand? So we've been encouraging the President and the Prime Minister when they meet on March 10th to talk about this. And there's this, we call our campaign group flathead.ca, which is Yellowstone to Yukon and Headwaters, Montana. My colleague Dave Haddon's here in the room, the National Parks and Conservation Association, the Sierra Club of BC, Wildside, a regional group, very good in Southeast British Columbia, and the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. We all work together on trying to get this done. We'd love your support. And then here's the big sleeper. You know, you do a nature talk, and the people who are really worried about the state of the world say, what about the climate? What about the climate? What's going to happen to climate? And this is the fear, is that we have these protected areas on the map, and then the rug is going to be pulled out of them by the climate as it moves. And then things will be left floundering without a place to live, and then we'll all die. This is the fear. Well, happily, that fear is turning out to be, I'm just going to jump to this. That fear is turning out to have some validity and a solution. Now, none of us knows what the climate monster will fully do, but we do know what it's been doing. And one of the important things is the climate is already changing. People who are from Glacier Park should know that. It's a little bit less icy than it used to be. That's the changing climate. And this is a really neat study of a 40-year study of observed climate change in England. So what happens as the climate's changing, the envelope, the niche these things live in is moving? Well, turns out that species are moving poleward or across the landscape, upslope, around aspect, like I was talking about earlier, and they're moving between protected areas as stepping stones. This is observed data. This isn't theoretical. So those big core protected areas connected to each other, which comes from theory, turns out to matter in fact. Protected areas are stepping stones and range shifts. Thus, many species are remaining protected across protected area networks. This is in England, where they don't have any large mammals. This is small things. It's very, very encouraging. So this is the big point. Nature needs half. We need to protect at least half the world in an interconnected way if we want to maintain a healthy, beautiful future. And why wouldn't we want to do that? Is there any reason these should not be our aspirations if we love nature? There is no reason on earth. So I just came back from this country, Bhutan. Bhutan is this country with about the same area as Western Montana and the same population as Western Montana. They have protected 51% of their country in an interconnected way, consciously. This is the map of their system. Fantastic. They have a tiger population, they have wild elephants, they have all intact. The bird fauna is all completely intact. It's an amazing place. And it's all because they've decided they want to hang on to nature. Next door is Nepal, which has horribly trashed its entire mid-elevation. These people have chosen not to. And they call this part of their strategy for gross national happiness. And they set a goal of gross national happiness. Now, this country set a goal of gross national happiness too. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Do you remember that? Trouble is everybody just talks about the liberty part, and there's competing definitions of liberty, right? Like liberty means I get to do whatever I want. If I'm a progressive, it means you can't tell me what to do, but you have this debate over liberty, but this idea of focusing on what would make us happy isn't what we talk about. Well, the Bhutanese talk about it. They focus on it. And part of their definition is intact nature. It's really cool. So they've done this. And their constitution obliges them to keep 60% forest cover. Constitutionally obliged. Now that happened in New York State too, interestingly enough, in the Adirondacks. You may not, by the Constitution of New York, cut any of the forest designated as forever wild in the Adirondack State Park. And there's 3 million acres of it in that condition. It's really quite fascinating. And Bob Marshall's father is the guy who made that happen in the 1890s. So it all comes back to this Bob Marshall story. So we have great examples here and in the world. By the way, western Montana and the Wyoming part into Idaho and up into Canada, we're dealing with one of the most intact opportunities in the world to knit the landscape back together and keep it intact. We're on the threshold of success. We're not on the threshold of failure. We're on the threshold of success. There were no wolves in this landscape 20 years ago when Diane started her study. They were coming in. Now you have a landscape with wolves in it, which I think is very good and very cool. You have more grizzly bears now than you had 40 years ago by far. Grizzly bears were on their way on the extinction wagon, little remnant populations in Glacier and in Yellowstone. Now their distribution is much bigger. Whatever your position is on delisting, there's no question the recovery of grizzly bears is way better than it was in this landscape. And this is what an idea can do. So this is conservation designations in the region in 1993, and this is where we are today. And we're not done, but it's a lot better. You can make progress. And what I've been talking about with such emphasis is this white hole here. We fix that, now we're really doing something. This is the most important linkage, the most important thing we can do for nature in North America is to do this on the Canadian side, particularly in British Columbia. Certainly the most important thing we can do for the health of western Montana's wildlife. No question about that. So what's this painting called? Okay, it's the painting of the 20th century. It's this sense, oh my God, things are awful. It's in college dorms all over. And think about how bad that is, that in college dorms, this is there. And this is because we are not offering an optimistic future to young people. We're offering, things are bad, they're getting worse. That's not an optimistic future. An optimistic future is we can do this, we can go there, we can make it better. And that's what I think our obligation to do, and the place that starts is with nature. So I'm going to move more abstractly here as I close. This is a photograph I took on the banks of the Manali River in the Indian Himalaya. And I was having a shirt made by a tailor, and he had just dumped his tailor's waste on the banks of the stream just past his place while I was waiting. I went and saw it, and I looked down at it, and I thought, this is the most wonderful metaphor for our world. It may be in tatters, but it's still beautiful. And we can think of the world as a beautiful, intact place. We don't have to think of it as a wasted place. And at the end of the day, this is what we need to get back to. What's this? So this is where we went wrong. Okay? The founding of Rome, we understood that wild nature nurtured us, right to the point of the foundational legend, the she-wolf suckling the twins that founded Rome. And then somehow on the way to the Forum, we lost track of the fact that we are nurtured by nature. And starting with the Romans, we started to believe we were in charge, that we could run the world to ourselves, to our standards. We could build aqueducts. We could change anything we wanted. Denuded the Mediterranean basin and ultimately caused the collapse of their civilization when they ran out of agricultural land. But nonetheless, that idea has stayed with us. And I want to emphasize this idea is only 2,000 years old, and it's only 2,000 years old in Western civilization. It's not a normal idea. It's not the foundational idea in many cultures. It's not the foundational idea in the Aboriginal cultures that were in North America first. They believe we're one species among many. And there's no scientist doing biology in the world who will tell you that humans are not part of nature. Not one. We are one mammal. We are one species among many. We are super abundant, and we have big brains, and we can give ourselves a beautiful, optimistic future, just like Bob Marshall gave us the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Thank you very much.